I ghosted my best friend years ago, but now she's back. She knows what I saw, and she won't stop until I finally face her. The first buzz of my phone barely registered in my half-asleep state. I reached for it out of habit, expecting some random notification, a work email, and maybe an automated message from my bank. Instead, a single text stared back at me from an unknown number. The words were simple, almost casual. Too casual. A chill ran down my spine before I even finished reading it. I knew exactly who had sent it. Natalie. For years I had done everything possible to disappear from her life. Numbers blocked, accounts deleted, every possible bridge burned without a second thought. And moving to a different city had been the final step, my way of ensuring she would never be able to reach me. It had worked, until now. I didn't answer. The weight of the past settled on my chest as I sat frozen, gripping my phone like it might shatter in my hands. Memories I'd spent years pushing away fought their way back, sharp and vivid. The night I left. The moment everything changed. The reason I could never go back. Hours passed, but the silence didn't last. Another message arrived, then an email. Then, later that evening, a letter. A plain envelope tucked neatly into my mailbox. My name scrawled across the front in a familiar hand. No return address, no explanation. Just proof that whatever distance I had put between us had disappeared overnight, and she had found me. And if she had gone through the trouble of tracking me down after all this time, it wasn't to reconnect. She knew. She knew exactly why I had left. And now, she was making sure I couldn't run again. The letter sat on my kitchen table, unopened. I hadn't touched it since I brought it inside. Hadn't even worked up the courage to flip it over. But I couldn't ignore it either. It was just there. A quiet reminder that I wasn't as far from my past as I'd convinced myself. I tried to go about my evening like normal, pretending that the pit in my stomach wasn't growing with every passing hour. I turned on the TV, but didn't really watch it. Made dinner, but barely touched it. Every little noise outside made my pulse jump, as if I expected her to be standing outside my door, waiting. It was stupid, really. Maybe she just wanted to talk. Maybe she wanted closure. Maybe, though I doubted it, this was just her way of making peace with the past. But deep down, I knew better. Natalie had never been the type to let things go. Even back when we were inseparable, she had a way of holding on to things. Grudges, secrets, people. She could smile and laugh like everything was fine. But there was always something behind it. Something calculated. She remembered everything. Not just what people did, but how they felt when they did it. It was one of the things that made her so magnetic. She knew exactly how to make you feel seen, like you were the most important person in the world. And she knew exactly how to make you feel small. I used to admire that about her. Thought it was a kind of strength. But now, all I could think about was the night I left. The thing I had seen. The reason I never gave her an explanation. I had told myself that as long as I stayed away, it couldn't touch me. That as long as I never said it out loud, it would stay buried. But I wasn't the only one who knew anymore. And whatever Natalie wanted, it wasn't just to talk. I lasted until midnight before I finally gave in. The letter had been taunting me all evening, a silent presence that I couldn't ignore no matter how hard I tried. It wasn't just curiosity, it was fear. Fear of what she had to say. Fear of what she knew. My hands were unsteady as I opened the envelope, unfolding the paper inside. There was no greeting, no explanation, just a single sentence written in that familiar, looping handwriting. You saw, didn't you? The room suddenly felt too small, like the walls were pressing in around me. It wasn't a question. Not really. She knew. My fingers tightened around the paper as my mind scrambled to rationalize, to find some other explanation. Maybe she was testing me. Maybe she wasn't sure and was fishing for a reaction. Maybe this was all just some sick, elaborate game. But deep down, I knew better. Natalie wasn't the type to ask unless she already had the answer. The memories I had spent years trying to suppress clawed their way back to the surface. The night I had run. The thing I had stumbled upon, so unexpected, so wrong that I had barely been able to process it. I had told myself that leaving was the safest option, that silence was the only way to stay out of it. But now she had found me, and this time silence wouldn't be enough. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the letter. That single sentence looping in my head and unraveling every wall I had built around the past. You saw, didn't you? It had been years. Years of silence, of pretending I had imagined it, convincing myself that if I never spoke of it, it would just disappear. But now, in Natalie's careful, deliberate handwriting, It was staring back at me. I tossed and turned for hours, my mind racing through possibilities. Was she testing me, trying to gauge my reaction? Or worse, had someone else told her what I saw? That thought made my skin crawl. I got out of bed when the first light of morning crept through the blinds, feeling like I hadn't rested at all. My body moved on autopilot. Shower, get dressed, make coffee, but none of it felt real. The weight of the letter sat in my chest, suffocating. I kept my phone face down on the counter, unwilling to check if she had sent more messages. I wasn't ready. But by noon my phone buzzed. I froze. It buzzed again and again. The notifications stacked on my screen, each one a slow tightening around my throat. My hands felt clammy as I finally flipped the phone over, my heart hammering against my ribs. Natalie had sent another text. "We need to talk. It's not going away." The words sent a chill through me. Not this isn't going away. Not I need answers. It's not going away. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. She wasn't just reaching out. She was pushing. She wasn't going to let this drop. I set the phone down and crossed the room to my window, barely breathing as I pulled the curtain back just an inch. My apartment overlooked the street below, a quiet block with only a few parked cars and the occasional passerby. Nothing seemed out of place. But that didn't mean she wasn't out there. Natalie had always been unpredictable. Obsessive, even. She never let things go, never accepted loose ends. And I was the biggest loose end of all. I paced the apartment, my mind flipping through every possible scenario. What was she trying to do? Was she here? Had she been watching me? I thought about the letter again. The fact that she had found my address. I had been so sure I'd buried that part of my life, that she'd never find me, that what I saw would stay in the past. But I had underestimated her. She wasn't just trying to talk. She was making sure I had nowhere left to run. The next 2 days passed in a blur of unease. Every errand, every step outside felt like stepping onto unstable ground. Strangers' faces seemed unfamiliar in a way that unsettled me, and the quiet routine of my life no longer felt safe. I avoided my usual spots, took a different route home, skipped the coffee shop I visited every morning, hesitated before unlocking my own front door. It didn't help. Natalie wasn't the kind of person you could outrun. She studied people, learned their habits, memorized their tells. It had always been her strength, something I once admired about her. Now it felt like a noose tightening around me. On the third day, my phone rang. The number was unknown, but I didn't need to see her name to know who it was. A deep, sinking feeling settled in my stomach as I stared at the screen, fingers hovering over the decline button. I should have ignored it. But I didn't. Bringing the phone to my ear, I hesitated, waiting for some kind of confirmation. At first there was nothing. Just silence. Then a voice. Low, steady, almost casual. A reminder that this was going to happen on her terms, not mine. That leaving had never been enough, and now I had to deal with the consequences. My grip tightened around the phone. My pulse roared in my ears. There was nothing threatening in the words themselves, but the meaning behind them was clear. She knew, and she was done waiting. The call ended without another sound, but the damage was already done. I stood there, phone still clutched in my hand, my own reflection staring back at me in the dark screen. This wasn't just a warning. It was a reminder that I had nowhere left to hide. The days after the call felt different. The city around me, the same streets I had walked for years, no longer felt like home. Every time I stepped outside, an invisible weight pressed down on me, as if I was being watched. Maybe I was. I told myself I was imagining it, that the feeling of eyes on me, the flicker of movement in my periphery, was just paranoia. But logic wasn't enough to quiet the instinct screaming at me to run. At work, my focus slipped. Simple tasks took longer, and I found myself staring blankly at my computer screen, unable to shake the feeling that something was closing in. Conversations blurred together. I nodded at the right times, forced small smiles, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. At night, the silence in my apartment felt heavier. I double-checked the locks, kept the curtains drawn. Any unfamiliar sound, a creak, a distant car door slamming, sent my heart racing. Sleep came in short, restless bursts, and every time I woke, my first instinct was to reach for my phone. She hadn't messaged again. That should have been a relief. It wasn't. Natalie was never the type to flood someone's inbox with desperate pleas for attention. She didn't ask for things. She orchestrated them. The silence wasn't her giving up. It was her waiting for the right moment to strike. And the worst part? I had no idea what she wanted. She knew I had seen something that night. That much was clear. But what did she expect me to do now? Apologize for running? Pretend like nothing had happened? Or was this about something bigger? About making sure I never spoke a word of it to anyone else? The idea sent a shiver down my spine. I had spent years convincing myself that staying silent had been the right choice, that leaving without an explanation had been the safest option. But maybe I had been wrong. Maybe Natalie had never needed me to say anything. Maybe just knowing was enough to make me a threat. The silence didn't last. I had barely started to convince myself that maybe Natalie had gotten what she wanted, that the phone call had been her final message, a way of reminding me that no matter how far I ran, she could always find me. Then I came home to my apartment door slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I had locked it. I always locked it. Double-checked it, pulled on the handle before leaving just to be sure. But now it was open by an inch, swaying slightly from the draft of the hallway. I stood frozen outside my own apartment, my breath coming too fast. My first instinct was to run, to turn around and get as far away as possible, but that wasn't an option. Because if Natalie had been inside, she had already made her point. I pushed the door open slowly. The apartment looked untouched at first glance. The furniture was where I had left it, my laptop still on the coffee table, no signs of forced entry. But the air inside felt wrong, just enough to make my skin crawl. I stepped inside carefully, my ears straining for any sound. Then I saw it. On the kitchen counter next to my untouched coffee mug from the morning sat a single object, a Polaroid. My fingers trembled as I reached for it, already knowing what I was going to see. It was a photo of me. Not an old one, not something from my past with Natalie. This was recent, taken from a distance. I was in my work clothes, walking down the street, head turned slightly like I'd just sensed someone watching me. The feeling I had been having for days, the paranoia, the weight of unseen eyes, hadn't been in my head. She had been watching me, and now she wanted me to know it. My hands shook as I gripped the Polaroid, my own face staring back at me. The angle, the distance, it was taken from the sidewalk across from my office. She hadn't just been watching. She had been close. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of it. I had been so careful. Changed routines, avoided familiar places, kept my head down. But none of it had mattered. Natalie had always been steps ahead of me, even when we were friends. Now she was playing, a game I didn't understand. I forced myself to breathe, to focus. I needed to check the apartment. Moving cautiously, I went from room to room, looking for any sign that she, or someone else, had been inside. Nothing seemed out of place. No broken locks, no missing belongings. It was as if she had slipped in just to leave the photo, then vanished without a trace. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't, because it meant she hadn't come here to steal anything. She had come to prove a point. She was close. She was watching. And she could get to me whenever she wanted. The weight of it pressed down on my chest as I sat heavily on the couch, still clutching the photo. What did she want? An admission, an apology, some kind of confrontation? Or was this something worse? My phone buzzed. The sound made me flinch, the Polaroid slipping from my fingers. I reached for my phone, already knowing who it would be. Another message. We need to talk. Stop making this harder than it has to be. I swallowed hard, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. She was done waiting. And now I had a choice. Keep running or finally face her. The message sat on my screen like a loaded gun. We need to talk. Stop making this harder than it has to be. I read it over and over, as if the meaning would somehow change, as if the words would rearrange themselves into something less final, less inevitable. But they didn't. They just sat there waiting, pressing down on my chest with a weight I couldn't shake. She wasn't asking anymore. She never really had been. Natalie had always had a way of bending people toward her will, making them think they had choices when, really, she had been leading them in one direction the entire time. I used to admire that about her. How effortlessly she could shift the pieces of any situation to suit her needs. It was easy to be close to her back then, to feel safe in the orbit of someone who always seemed to know exactly what to do. But now, that same ability, the one that once made her magnetic, felt suffocating. I set my phone down, pressing my palms against the table, trying to think. But there was nothing to think about, not really. She had already proven that ignoring her wouldn't work. If she could find me, if she could get into my apartment, leave a picture on my counter without so much as a sound, then she could do worse. And maybe she would, if I kept pretending I had a choice. The room felt smaller as I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly, my mind racing through every possible outcome. If I answered, I was walking into a situation I didn't understand, playing by her rules. But if I didn't, I had no illusions about who Natalie was. Silence wouldn't make her go away. With my heart hammering in my chest, I picked up my phone again, my fingers hesitating before finally typing out a response. "Where?" The reply came within seconds. "A cafe. Not just any cafe, our cafe. The same one we had spent hours in, curled up in the corner booth, whispering about everything and nothing. The place where we had mapped out our futures, where we had planned adventures that never happened, where we had laughed over coffee that always went cold before we could finish it. That wasn't an accident. Natalie didn't do accidents. She wanted me to remember. To feel the weight of everything that it had been, everything that had changed. I stared at the message, my pulse loud in my ears. I could still back out, block the number, pack a bag, leave town, disappear again. But that was the lie I had been telling myself for years. That distance could fix what I had seen that night. Natalie had just proven that distance meant nothing. And now, whether I was ready or not, I was going to see her again. The cafe stood exactly as I remembered it. It should have felt comforting, familiar, but instead, the sight of it sent a cold weight settling deep in my stomach. Everything was the same, the old neon sign flickering weakly above the door, the soft hum of conversation drifting through the windows, the warm glow inside that once made it feel like a second home. But I wasn't the same. I lingered outside for a moment longer than necessary, my fingers tightening around the strap of my bag. The rational part of me screamed to turn around, to walk away before I made the biggest mistake of my life. But logic wasn't in control anymore. I had let Natalie set the rules the moment I responded to her message. And now, I had to see this through. Stepping inside, I was immediately hit with the familiar scent of coffee and pastries, but none of it registered. My attention had already locked onto the far corner of the room where she was waiting. Natalie. She had taken the same booth we always used to claim, her back to the wall, giving her the perfect vantage point to see everyone who walked in. She hadn't changed. Not really. Her hair was still sleek, her posture effortlessly composed, her expression unreadable. She wasn't looking at me, not directly, but I knew she had registered my presence the moment I stepped through the door. She always knew. For a brief second I stood there hovering near the entrance like an outsider in my own past. My mind flashed back to all the times we had sat in that booth together, lost in conversation, the rest of the world fading into the background. Back when I thought I knew everything about her, back before I learned the truth. Pushing down the unease clawing at my chest, I forced my legs to move. Each step towards her felt heavier, as if I were walking into something I couldn't escape. She didn't acknowledge me right away, not until I finally slid into the seat across from her. Only then did she lift her gaze, slowly, deliberately, as if she were peeling back layers, searching for something in my expression. There was no smile, no warmth, just quiet observation. She didn't have to say anything. The weight of the moment spoke for itself. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, before she finally tilted her head slightly, a flicker of something, satisfaction, amusement, crossing her face. She had been expecting me. Not hoping, expecting. And that was when I realized just how deep into this game I had already fallen. I had walked straight into exactly what she wanted.